Before the applause faded, before the headlines turned from praise to scrutiny, there was a man standing quietly behind the myth. A global icon whose face filled screens, whose characters lived louder than most real men ever could, and whose private world was slowly, painfully fracturing out of sight. The cameras captured the costumes, the charisma, the box office glory, but they could not capture the nights of uncertainty, the legal storms, the emotional fatigue of being watched, judged, and rewritten by the public gaze. Fame had built him into a legend, yet it could not shield him from collapse, controversy, or the slow erosion of trust. In the silence between courtrooms, interviews, and vanished friendships, a different reality emerged, one not written by studios, but by consequence. How does a man spend decades becoming untouchable, only to discover that reputation is the most fragile role he ever played? And when the world decides your story for you, what remains of the truth? The lights arrive first, harsh, white, surgical, cutting through studio haze and settling onto a figure already half-transformed. Layers of fabric, metal, pigment, and stitched illusion hang from his frame like ceremonial armor. Crew members speak in hushed technical bursts. Brushes move across skin. Wigs are adjusted by steady hands trained not to tremble in the presence of fame. And in the center of this orchestrated ritual sits Johnny Depp, still, unreadable, eyes lowered, as if the becoming matters more than the being. The set is never quiet, yet he carries silence with him. Between instructions and camera resets, he retreats inward, posture folding slightly, gaze drifting beyond the constructed world around him. The characters are loud, flamboyant, haunted, mythic, but the man between takes is measured, almost ghost-like. Transformation is not performance here, it is refuge. Each role offers architecture for emotions too complex to display without disguise. Each costume is permission to feel without exposure. Directors describe commitment. Producers call it genius. Audiences call it magic. The industry, with its polished hunger, calls it bankable. But beneath the celebration lives a more fragile mechanism, a psyche that feels safest when hidden inside invention. The distance between mask and self grows with every successful metamorphosis. Praise strengthens the persona while quietly thinning the private core beneath it. Fame builds quickly, then faster. Franchises expand. Characters become cultural symbols. His likeness multiplies across posters, merchandise, and midnight premieres where crowds roar before he speaks. The sound is thunderous, admiration amplified into pressure. Expectation becomes constant weather. There is no neutral day, no anonymous hour. The myth must remain alive, unpredictable, entertaining, even when fatigue settles behind the eyes. Observers begin to notice the subtle tells. The longer pauses before interviews. The deflections wrapped in humor. The way conversation turns toward art, music, and craft, but veers away from anything personal with practiced elegance. Control becomes essential, over roles, over scripts, over how much of himself reaches the surface. Not vanity, preservation. Hollywood feeds on distinctiveness, then demands repetition of it. The very unpredictability that made him invaluable becomes a formula others want replicated on schedule. Creative tension forms. Art versus expectation, instinct versus obligation. Meetings grow heavier. Negotiations grow sharper. The machine wants consistency. The artist survives on risk. Behind closed doors, the schedule is no longer just busy, it is consuming. Sleep shortens. Trust circles tighten. Creative disagreements feel more personal than professional. The laughter remains, but those closest begin to hear strain beneath it, like stress lines under polished paint. The persona is thriving in public view, expansive, theatrical, adored. The private man is narrowing, protective, watchful, tired. Cameras never capture the moment after the room empties, when costume pieces are removed one by one, when color is wiped away, when the mirror reflects not a legend but a human face carrying the residue of expectation. In those quiet minutes, the performance ends, but the pressure does not. And beyond the glow of sets and premieres, beyond the mythology of characters, the deeper story waits, rooted not in stardom, but in survival, in a childhood that first taught him how necessary it was to disappear inside a mask. The world knows the characters, but not the childhood that taught him to hide inside them. Before the cameras, before the characters, before the cultivated mystique, there is a boy learning how to read the temperature of a room before he enters it. Doors close louder in memory than in sound. Voices rise, fall, disappear. The atmosphere of home shifts without warning, and stability feels less like a promise and more like a rumor. Childhood becomes an exercise in emotional weather watching, scanning tones, footsteps, silences, building instincts not from safety, but from adaptation. The family moves often, geography changing faster than friendships can root. Bedrooms are temporary. Schools are interruptions. Goodbyes become routine enough to feel expected. With each relocation, identity resets, and the young mind learns the efficiency of partial attachment. It is easier not to anchor than to be uprooted again. Authority figures rotate. Rules change. Consistency dissolves. What remains constant is tension, sometimes loud, sometimes buried, but always present enough to shape behavior. He learns early that confrontation escalates, but withdrawal protects. Silence becomes strategy. Observation becomes power. Inside that quiet, imagination begins constructing alternate interiors, worlds where emotion can be rearranged, replayed, controlled. Music arrives not as hobby, but as lifeline. A guitar in hand becomes both shield and translator. Sound expresses what speech cannot safely carry. Notes hold anger without punishment, sadness without exposure. Practice becomes ritual. Volume becomes release. Structure, school bells, rigid expectations, prescribed paths, feels less like guidance and more like confinement. Creative instinct resists containment. He drifts toward subcultures, toward art, toward people who live outside straight lines. There is risk there, but also recognition. Belonging appears in fragments: a band rehearsal, a late conversation, a shared creative obsession. Relationships ignite quickly, intensely, drawn by emotional honesty, and sometimes collapse just as fast under pressure and mistrust learned too young. Early rejection does not weaken resolve, it hardens it. Each dismissal becomes proof that approval is unstable currency. Defiance grows beside sensitivity, twin forces shaping personality. He does not dream of fame yet. He dreams of escape, from volatility, from invisibility, from powerlessness. Artistic freedom is not ambition, it is oxygen. When small opportunities appear, auditions, introductions, creative chances, they feel like trapdoors opening beneath circumstance. Rescue and risk arrive together. To be seen offers possibility, but also judgment. And judgment carries the familiar echo of earlier criticism, earlier instability. Visibility feels dangerous, but remaining unseen feels worse. Those who meet him in these early years notice contradiction. Guarded yet emotionally perceptive, rebellious yet deeply affected by disappointment, detached in posture but intense in creative focus. The armor is forming, not from arrogance, but from repeated emotional exposure without reliable protection. Then the door opens, not gradually, but suddenly. A role appears, a real one, not symbolic, structural. A foothold inside the industry he once viewed from a distance. It looks like a rival from the outside. Inside, it feels like stepping onto a faster-moving surface than expected. Because breakthrough is not relief, it is ignition. The breakthrough role changes everything. But fame awakens pressures he was never prepared to carry. The rise does not feel like climbing. It feels like acceleration. One defining role becomes two, then five, then a gallery of characters so vivid they begin to eclipse the actor beneath them. Box office numbers swell into headlines. Opening weekends become global events. Costumes become cultural symbols. Audiences do not just watch, they imitate, quote, costume, embody. The transformation artist becomes transformed into an institution. Sets grow larger. Budgets grow heavier. The machinery around each performance expands. More handlers, more contracts, more voices with financial stakes in every decision. What once felt like artistic exploration now carries the gravity of corporate expectation. Uniqueness, the very trait that opened the door, becomes a product line to be reproduced on schedule. Risk is praised publicly and negotiated privately. Franchise filmmaking brings a strange duality: creative immortality paired with creative confinement. The character must remain recognizable, yet feel new. The performance must evolve, yet stay market-safe. Meetings stretch late into guarded conversations about audience appetite and brand continuity. The artist listens, but something inward resists duplication. Repetition begins to feel like erosion. Public fascination intensifies. Crowds gather not just for premieres, but for sightings. Cameras extend into private hours. Restaurants become stages. Airports become arenas. Privacy does not vanish all at once. It dissolves by degrees. Ordinary movement requires strategy. Silence becomes interpreted. Expression becomes analyzed. The external world grows louder as the internal world grows more guarded. Interviews turn into theater, not dishonest, but curated. Humor is deployed like lighting, angled, flattering, deflective. Questions circle toward the personal. Answers pivot toward the professional. The charm remains intact, but it is now deliberate, a maintained instrument rather than a spontaneous impulse. Each appearance carries invisible preparation. What to reveal, what to protect, what to redirect. Success multiplies obligations. Financial ecosystems form, properties, staff, dependents, legal frameworks, layered management. Each commitment adds weight to the calendar and consequence to each decision. Disputes emerge, contractual, professional, interpersonal, some resolve quietly, others leaving residue. Trust becomes both more valuable and more scarce. Those closest observe fluctuation, periods of intense creative fire followed by stretches of visible exhaustion. Energy burns bright, then low. Enthusiasm and irritation sometimes share the same hour. The brilliance remains, improvisational, fearless, detailed, but it now coexists with fatigue that sleep does not fully cure. Burnout does not arrive as collapse. It arrives as thinning patience and deepened retreat. Relationships strain under asymmetry. One life lived publicly, others forced to orbit it. Misunderstandings widen in the shadow of schedules and scrutiny. Emotional privacy becomes harder to negotiate than contractual privacy. Vulnerability feels riskier when any fragment can become narrative fuel. The distance between the private man and the public figure stretches further each year, not from deception, but from preservation. Persona becomes pressure suit. Without it, exposure would feel unbearable. With it, authenticity feels increasingly distant. The balance grows fragile. Then the boundary breaks. Private conflict, once contained within homes, messages, and closed rooms, spills outward into formal accusations and legal language. Personal turmoil becomes documented, filed, argued. The story detaches from performance and attaches to controversy. Interpretation replaces imagination. Commentary replaces critique. The cameras are still present, but they are no longer pointed at characters. The story is no longer being told by films, but by headlines. The stage has changed. No longer are the lights soft and controlled. No longer are cameras angled to capture artistry. Now the glare comes uninvited, sharp, unflinching, merciless. Courtrooms replace soundstages. Hallways echo not with rehearsed dialogue, but with the shuffle of papers, the muted murmur of legal teams, the scratch of pens recording every word. Here, every gesture, every pause, every inflection carries weight, dissected not by directors, but by juries, pundits, and millions of unseen observers. Reputation, once a byproduct of performance, becomes the protagonist of a global spectacle, and the man behind it recedes further into the shadows. Statements become scripts. Testimony becomes performance under pressure with consequences that no applause can mitigate. Every movement is replayed, every phrase examined, every past decision filtered through a lens of accusation or defense. Supporters rally, critics sharpen arguments, and both camps speak as though they alone hold truth. But the truth is heavier, more fragmented, more resistant to simplification. The young man who once withdrew behind music and costume must now navigate exposure on a scale never imagined, a psychological labyrinth in which privacy is the impossible prize. Time itself compresses. What once spanned years in measured progress collapses into a season of relentless judgment. Headlines erupt hourly, social media surges in waves, and the noise becomes physical, a weight pressing at the chest, a constant vibration beneath the skin. Emotional exposure is no longer private. It is broadcast, annotated, debated, shared. Loneliness is not absence, but scrutiny. Even in company, the individual is isolated, observed, and interpreted. Every friend, every colleague, every family member feels the tension, the stakes amplified by public observation. Professional obligations stall. Projects pause. Commitments are renegotiated. Silence becomes both strategy and burden. To speak risks escalation. To stay quiet invites speculation. The delicate calculus of public survival is exhausting, unrelenting, and impossible to perfect. The man who once thrived on controlled transformation now confronts a world where control is illusionary. Trust fractures. Alliances are tested. Relationships strain under the weight of expectation and fear. Yet, within this chaos, a stubborn resolve begins to crystallize. Survival is no longer optional. Endurance becomes the only path forward. There is no evasion, no escape, only navigation of the storm. Words are chosen deliberately. Actions are measured carefully. Emotional armor, once optional, now becomes necessity. Every day is a negotiation between visibility and self-preservation. The pressure does not relent. It is sustained, intense, inescapable. Verdicts arrive, public and private, symbolic and literal. Some bring resolution. Some bring validation. But they do not restore what has been lost. Confidence is shaken. Relationships are altered. Self-perception is refracted through the prism of scrutiny. The legal battles may close, but the emotional wounds persist, invisible yet persistent, lingering in quiet moments after the cameras leave. And when the noise finally fades, when the courts are empty and the press cycles slow, he is left alone with the echo of everything that has happened, a silence that is no longer protective, but demanding. The question emerges not from others, but from within. Who remains when all external battles have been fought? What does identity mean without defense? What remains when the world stops telling the story? When the noise fades, he must face the quiet and decide who he is without the battle. The roar has faded. The flashbulbs no longer punctuate each movement. Courtrooms are empty, press releases have slowed, and the cameras, once relentless, finally retreat. For the first time in decades, Johnny Depp is confronted not by schedules, scripts, or headlines, but by silence. It is a silence that feels unfamiliar, almost disorienting, carrying with it the weight of every choice, every compromise, every public gaze that once defined him. In this rare quiet, reflection seeps in, slow and deliberate, like light stretching across a vacant room. The legend remains recognizable. Even in the absence of daily spectacle, the public sees the man they have come to know through roles and reputation. Yet internally, the terrain has shifted. Priorities, once dictated by studio contracts, media cycles, and fan expectations, now bend toward personal agency. Small projects receive attention not for their market potential, but for creative authenticity. Appearances are selective, carefully curated, a deliberate measure of control over what reaches the world and what remains guarded. With the pace slowing, the mind ventures into territory long denied, introspection. The psychological landscape changes from survival and defense to meaning-making. What does legacy mean when stripped of headlines? When performances end, awards are archived, and public fascination fades. What remains of the man who carried it all? Artistic identity is revisited with subtlety, no longer as spectacle, but as craft in its purest form. Every movement, every choice, every return to the work carries intentionality. Trust, once fragmented by relentless scrutiny, is rebuilt carefully, privately, with those who understand the cost of exposure and endurance. The emotional toll of decades in the spotlight is finally visible in full, not just in the fatigue that once crept into sets and interviews, but in the subtler currency of relationships strained, ambitions reshaped, and intimacy cautiously re-entered. What was gained, fame, fortune, artistry, is acknowledged. But equally tangible is what was spent. Years of privacy, the erosion of simple trust, the weight of expectation pressing on identity itself. The reckoning is quiet, internal, and profound. Reinvention unfolds deliberately. Gone are the theatrical flourishes designed to command attention. In their place is a tempered exploration of self, of craft, of purpose. The question no longer asks how to remain famous, but how to remain whole. Daily rituals, creative experiments, careful reconnections, and contemplative silence all mark a new rhythm, one that balances visibility with integrity, public engagement with private preservation. And in this quieter, deliberate pursuit, victory arrives differently. It is not applause-driven or headline-defined. It is human, incomplete, and still in motion, a kind of triumph measured not by external recognition, but by the reclamation of self and agency. The final chapter of his story is not written by scandal or success, but by what he chooses next,